Thank you so much for your time today, and I appreciate this chance to get together. One of the first things, I know it looks like we're going to talk about bankruptcy and restructuring. What I was actually going to suggest that perhaps a better bill, and I'm curious about what kind of support we might have, is that it should be illegal for Siri to translate information that's different than we might have said. If you this morning I had an unfortunate situation where something I tweeted to my wife didn't go out quite the same way when I used the voice to transcription feature of the cell phone. So Siri should be chastised for doing that. But with that being said, let me tell you what we want to talk to you about today. About 2 to 4 years ago, I made a comment when I decided to run for office that the Commonwealth has between 2 to 4 years to resolve its financial crisis. And if we didn't do so, the financial problems that we're dealing with would continue in such a way that we'd be unable to solve our problems because of political issues. About August of 20th of this past year, I introduced House Bill 13 to get a perspective of what we might need to do to resolve some of the property tax issues. And in that, obviously, we had some feedback that came about from different constituencies that were interested in the group, in the tax proposal that we had. And one of the things that we obviously found out was the following. About 60 to 65% of the people that were polled were in favor of House Bill 13. About 10% were neutral, and about 25% were opposed. But the 25% that were opposed were candidly in one demographic. And that one demographic is seniors, which is something you would obviously expect. So what I wanted to say to you is, as a result of getting some great feedback from my colleagues and some other work that we're doing, what we're officially announcing today is this, is we're going to table House Bill 13. What I'm going to do is specifically pull back on that, and I want to thank AARP, candidly the Chamber, and NFIB for some great feedback that they provided along the way. The Independent Fiscal Office recently came out with an analysis of the 5-year forecast, which reaffirms that the grain of Pennsylvania is going to be a problem. And we have some long-term significant systemic problems that we have to deal with. So as a result of that, and my practice in what we had done in my prior life, which is helping to keep companies out of bankruptcy, once you realize you're in a situation where there are no acceptable financial alternatives, you have to look at the options. And so as I went around the state, I found out something loud and clear, was that there was a significant number of misunderstandings about what happens if someone goes bankrupt. So let me give you an example of some of the myths that we found. First issue was that bankruptcy is designed to protect the debtor. So if the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has a significant amount of debt, if something were to go wrong, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would just declare bankruptcy. The court would then side with Pennsylvania, and all would be well. And that's not the case. Representative Tornecker is an attorney, and he does some bankruptcy work, and he will tell you today, quite candidly, that bankruptcy is designed to protect the creditor and not the debtor. And we should be aware of that. We have a list of some bankruptcy myths that you might want to be aware of. And one of the things that we found, and I heard loud and clear, is that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania cannot go bankrupt. And that is absolutely false. So our study group that we're doing under House Bill 1995 is specifically designed to examine some of these myths so that policymakers are armed with the best information imaginable as we make these various types of decisions that we have to. So let me give you an example. Puerto Rico is already in bankruptcy. So it's difficult for a state to go bankrupt. So the United States Supreme Court ruled with the Obama administration and at that time Speaker Ryan and the United States Senate about how they would have to craft a bill to allow it. And on May 3rd, 2017, Puerto Rico entered bankruptcy, and that is currently in bankruptcy now. There are other states, according to the Markakis Institute, that are on the bankruptcy watch list, and that's the reason for this discussion today. In Pennsylvania, I believe we have 2 to 4 years to turn around our financial ship, before which we can't possibly execute the fixes fast enough to avoid an insolvency. Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Kentucky are listed to be the first 5 states that would be the victims of a bankruptcy. And quite candidly, I actually project, from my perspective, that you'll see a situation in all likelihood that Illinois will likely be in the year 2020. And once that happens, then everybody will get some degree of religion. So the purpose of our study of House Bill 1995 is to give us the opportunity to go out, examine these myths, and you'll see some of the other myths that will happen as an example. And I want to be very clear on this so there's no misunderstanding. I personally believe in my business practice of keeping companies out of bankruptcy, that my goal is to pay every creditor 100 cents on the dollar. But one of the perceptions is that state pensions are guaranteed, and that is just not accurate. And the reason I want to, now I believe that we can take the decisive actions necessary, and that's the reason we're joining with Representative Seth Grove and the representatives you have here. We have a significant number of government reform bills that, if implemented, will provide us with those kinds of opportunities to allow us to get to the point that we need to get to. So what I want you to be aware of is, as we start to do this, is that we're trying to sound the warning signal loud and clear, and I'm very proud of our leadership team that they've taken the steps already. We did a pension reform bill 2 years ago. That was an important step. We passed a bill for the Auditor General Enforcement Act that became part of the fiscal code about two years ago as well. We've done some fiscal restraints and spending cuts that I thought were important, although we just found that there was an additional $779 million that the governor asked for supplemental this year. And so what we want you to be aware of is that we're in booming economic times, and we're not putting money away for a rainy day fund. So to the extent that we don't do that, we're going to have a crisis of almost biblical proportions. But here's what happens in my years of doing bankruptcy. There becomes a center of gravity. And once that center of gravity is pushed, it creates a death spiral. And that death spiral then becomes extremely difficult to get out of. So once we get beyond this 2 to 4 year window, the probability of doing a restructuring smartly diminishes over time. We've been joined by Representative Seth Grove, who has a number of the bills that you'll see here, House Bills 52 through 58, and he's the champion of that. The people standing with me today are champions of these reform measures. And what is important for you to be aware of is that we have time, we can honor all of our commitments, and our drop-dead date in Pennsylvania is 12 years. In 12 years, our cash flows are into a point where they become critical in nature. Now, I do want to tell you, as someone who does economic projections all the time, there will become a point in time if we have a recession like we had in 08 and 09, all bets will be off. But as we start to look at some of these measures, I just want you to be aware, the minute the first state, such as Illinois, becomes insolvent, what will happen is the capital markets for all the other states start to dry up almost overnight. If you remember what happened in 2008 and 2009, Michael Lewis wrote a book. It was called The Big Short. And the entire housing market was based upon the assumption that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's obligations and mortgages were guaranteed by the federal government, and they were not. We found out the consequence of that misunderstanding. That's the purpose of this bill today and the reform measures. So I'm going to mention two of the reform measures, and I'd like to turn over to Representative Seth Grove, and then obviously some of the other representatives would like to speak as well, and then we'd like to open it up for questions. So the first thing I want to tell you is we have House Bill 985, which is the Auditor General Enforcement Act, and which that does is it provides the Auditor General with subpoena power. It's already in the Senate. It cleared the House of Representatives about 4 months ago. We're hoping to get that moved. That provides training and capability of the members of the Auditor General staff, so we have the ability to go after this fraud that might happen. And it's very similar to the reforms that were done with the Office of Inspector General. That was a Senate-led effort from 2 years ago, and we're already starting to see the dividends coming out of that now. But as I said, it takes a while to get these things started up. So House Bill 985 does that. House Bill 1053 is a lean government initiative, LEAN, and what that does is help the government be able to get its spending under control so we can use those funds to start to pay down some of our debt. With that, what I'd like to do is ask my dear friend Seth Grove to come in and talk about House Bills 52 to 58. And I know Representative Kiefer's got some bills as well, and Representative Lewis as well. Seth.
Thanks, Frank.
God bless you.
Semper Fi, brother.
Semper Fi.
Thanks for having me, Frank. Appreciate your work. Obviously, what we don't want in Pennsylvania is to be like Illinois or New Jersey. There are some financially distraught states across the nation, and I really applaud what Frank's doing, looking at their solvency problems and ensuring they don't happen here. To an extent, we have done some of the similar financial decisions that Illinois has done in the past. They tend to be considered financial gimmicks or fiscal evasion, some other terms for them. But by reviewing what other states have done, our internal processes, making sure that we do not follow the same path is critical for the taxpayers and residents of Pennsylvania moving forward. There's some bad examples of states, and then there's some great examples of states. There's some well-financed states in the United States that we can model after. Top of the list is Utah. They bleed financial management. Every member, Republican, Democrat, focuses on good financial practices. They care about it to the extent where they have conversations around, if we lose all our federal funding, how do we maintain our state government moving forward? Not a lot of people have those discussions, but they're dedicated to it. Prudent financial management is a cornerstone of governing, and we need to make sure that Pennsylvania has the best financial management statutes, policies, and culture, and that will help us propel us moving forward. I think Frank's Solvency Commission is a critical step in that, reviewing best practices and worst practices. Another group of bills we have, and there's a couple prime sponsor of those agency merger bills, House Bill 52 through 58. They merge 8 agencies down to 4, and it tries to right-size government moving forward, reduce regulations and reduce costs to taxpayers. What we're looking to do is get better services at lower cost. Another very important bill is House Bill 93. It's the SMART Act. It is outcome-based budgeting. If you're not familiar, our budget process was put in place in 1978. It's 41 years old. The first Star Wars movie came out in 1978, and we've had many iterations of Star Wars since our budget process took into effect. Actually, it's a year older than me. I did celebrate my 40th birthday this past year. So reforming the budget process and not having the same stale old mechanisms in place, I think is critical to improving our financial management. Many states have gone over to a performance-based budgeting system, zero-based budgeting system. So making those differences and actually looking at what agencies are spending, what are the actual performance of those programs, and how do we improve them? If they're not efficient and there's no way to improve them, get rid of them. Or is there duplication? Are we asking agencies in programs to do the same thing in different agencies that we don't need that duplication of service and thus save tax dollars? Or find a program that is actually successful and putting more money into it. So there's multiple reasons to redo our entire budget process and refocus our current process moving forward. So with that, throw over to Frank or anybody else that wants to talk.
Let me do this. I was going to have Representative Dawn Kiefer talk about one of her bills, then Representative Andrew Lewis make a mention about his municipal reform bill as it relates to the pension debt, or not the pension debt, but debt and the ethics requirements of it. And then I was going to have just kind of a summary commentary that comes up and open it up for questions. So it'll be fairly quick. Dawn.
Thank you. So I'd like to applaud Representative Grove and Representative Ryan for really taking the charge and taking the lead on some of this fiscal reform that we have in state government. I didn't come here on fiscal reform. That wasn't what I was really hyped to get to work on. But if the average person comes into the government and tries to wrap their head around how we budget, it would be mind-boggling. And so I've spent months digging into how this works. And the way that we budget in Pennsylvania, fiscal evasion is the best terminology I can give for how we budget in Pennsylvania. So I have literally asked a lot of questions, a lot of unhelpful questions, I'm told, just to try to figure it out. And we have to get our fiscal house in order. We have been on autopilot for so long. I've introduced a zero-based budgeting and other bills to help supplement what Representative Grove and Representative Ryan are doing, but this is going to be a multi-pronged effort to try to get our house in order. Just recently, went out on second was a pension reform bill that I have that just does stress testing. And so it sets up 3 different scenarios and some different testing that we would do, that we require of banks already, to give you a scenario. What happens if we go into recession? What if we fall 20 points below the market or 20 points over, to see how we should be planning, what decisions we should be making when we're determining what the policy will be for our pension. And as legislators, we often don't get this information. So my bill would require that not only do they run these stress tests that are prescriptive, but that they give them to the IFO to summarize and to report to the General Assembly so that we can make a good, conscious decision with current and relevant information. So we're going to continue to work on this. I appreciate everybody coming today, and I hope that we really can make some forward movement with some of this legislation to do the work that we need to do to make sure we don't fall over that financial cliff. Thank you.
Good morning. You know, taxpayers across the Commonwealth are counting on us and entrusting us here in Harrisburg to be wise stewards of their money. And the reality is, at the end of the day, tax revenue does not belong to the legislature. It belongs to the people who sent us here. And so it's imperative that we work together to fundamentally reform the processes by which we spend these dollars. And so I'm excited to join forces with an outstanding group of colleagues. And I thank Representative Grove and Representative Ryan for your leadership on this. And we have joined forces to fundamentally improve and change the process by which we spend the taxpayers' dollars, so that it's a wise spending, it's restrained spending, and there's fiscal stability and responsibility that results. And so I'm really excited about this series of proposals and reforms. And one of them that I've introduced along with House Bill 1990 is House Bill 883. And what this is, it deals with municipal spending, because this is a holistic approach. We're not just talking state spending, we're also talking all public spending across the Commonwealth. And this municipal reform bill introduces an ethics and accountability and transparency component that is currently lacking with municipal spending. And basically what it says is, look, if you're going to borrow money on the backs of taxpayers, you do not get to shift a portion of those funds to a private slush fund for a purpose other than what you borrowed the money for. If you're going to tell the taxpayers we want to restore this bridge or we want to build this crosswalk, we're going to borrow funds, you do not get to take a portion of those funds under this bill and shift it somewhere else where the taxpayers don't know. So this is about responsibility, it's about transparency, and there's also an enforcement component with penalties enacted if municipalities violate this. That also introduces an accountability provision as well. So these are the kind of changes we need to get our state back on the right track so we can be the top state in the nation from an economic stability standpoint. And I appreciate the hard work of all of my colleagues here today. Thank you.
Let me finish up with this, and then would like to open up for questions. I have this hat here, my Marine Corps hat. It says Semper Fi, and that's a Latin expression that says Semper Fidelis, always faithful. And in my practice area of doing and keeping companies out of bankruptcy for the past 45 years, the entire focus is to honor the creditors and the debtors as much as you possibly can. And in my mind, it's my moral and ethical responsibility to honor the commitments that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has made to the public sector retirees, as well as to the taxpayers of the Commonwealth and those who are beneficiaries of the Commonwealth services. These reforms are needed. Time is not on our side. The reforms that you see there, our leadership team in both the House and the Senate have been absolutely phenomenal in getting these done. You'll see me frequently wear the red cap that says Nations 911. And that's the sense of an emergency that we have to get it done. People who do the kind of work that I do for a living, keeping companies out of bankruptcy, are not known to be the most popular people. We typically, whenever I do an engagement, you walk in. I had a client call me up one time. He said, Frank, I think I'm in trouble. I said, what makes you think you're in trouble? I can't make payroll tomorrow. Well, you're in trouble. And in that particular case, we had to tell people you're not going to get paid that day. I don't want that coming to Pennsylvania. My colleagues don't want that to happen. We're not in danger of that right now. But if we don't take decisive action now, we could be in 12 years. Illinois is in that position now. Illinois is questioning how much can they possibly borrow to make payroll. What are they trying to do? So here's what will be the triggering event, the next recession. What you need to be aware of, you'll hear comments about the underfunding of the pension obligations. The ARC payment, you've heard about that. That ARC payment is that high because of how much money that was lost in the 01 recession and the '08 recession. We're talking $68 billion was lost into pension systems in those two triggering events. That's what brings your payroll costs, 20% of your property taxes are due to cover unfunded pension obligations. If there's another significant recession, that number, that percentage of payroll in your school districts could approach 50% from 34.29% now. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, and we can do that by enacting these reforms. But one of the things I found loud and clear going through the Commonwealth is there are some myths that we need to make sure that all policymakers understand. That it cannot be business as usual. We have to recognize that a state can fail. I recall hearing a commentary recently in '08, General Motors was too big to fail, and I think we know that's not accurate. Bethlehem Steel no longer exists. Pennsylvania Railroad no longer exists. The coal mining industry in Pennsylvania is a mere fraction of what it was 100 years ago. Industries can fail, states can fail, and I've had the unfortunate, dubious distinction in my career in the Marine Corps of having been in 7 nations that no longer exist. We have to take this seriously. We can do it. I'm optimistic about our future, but we have to get real about our present. With that, we'd welcome any questions you might have. Oh, I'm sorry. Dizzy.
You touched on the stability of the pension system and how that could be affected, but could you just kind of elaborate on the direct impacts that state residents would see if the state would default? I know the budget can kind of be viewed as this sort of mythical thing that residents think may not have a direct impact on them. So could you just kind of elaborate?
Absolutely. So the question was, he said, what happens in the event that a state, how would a resident feel would happen? You'll start to see cutbacks in services. So let me give you an example where you'll start to see the first ones. In my own county, Lebanon County, the senior center went bankrupt. And what happens is you'll start to see peripheral services. We're already seeing the care of the elderly now, where they're saying the reimbursement rates for Medicare and Medicaid are problematic. And so because of the reimbursement rates of so much dollars per day, there's not enough money for home health care for senior citizens. Those things will start to become exacerbated. You know, the AARP was phenomenal in dealing with this issue, saying and guiding me, saying, you know, we do have a crisis. We have to recognize we have an imbalance. The Independent Fiscal Office made a commentary in their press release, and I think as we get a chance, you want to see what happens. And I think it's probably one of the most telling commentaries that you might want to look at. And it's his third bullet in his press release. And what it basically said is, with the grain of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, these I'm translating a little bit, put it in my words instead of directly his, but in the grain of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, what we're seeing is a situation in which the tax burden that will fall on the working age cohort will have to increase at such a rate to cover the cost of our budget instability, that'll be a problem. I had a legislator tell me, Frank, I've never once raised property taxes. And that's significant. So how will the average Pennsylvania find it? Your property taxes will start going up at an increasing rate. And that's, for many people, you're going to find that hard to believe. Representative Grove was extraordinarily helpful to me, and we're supporting the plan that he and Representative Kiefer are working on for property tax reform, since I'm going to table my bill. But if we don't deal with this, what's going to happen is you'll see people in homes find it more difficult to keep their homes. I estimate in the next recession, 180,000 Pennsylvanians will lose their homes due to property tax foreclosure. That's how you're going to start to feel it. It'll start being at the peripheral ends. Those people that are most economically vulnerable will be the first casualties. And then the need for additional social services. Another wise gentleman made a comment to me. He said, Frank, I guarantee you in a budget cutback, no one can justify making a pension payment relative to making a payment of a cost for children with disabilities in a public school system. So you'll start to see some unacceptable trade-offs that'll be a problem. So this will how it start to be manifest, and then it'll snowball. That's what you're seeing in East St. Louis, that just had their municipal funds confiscated to pay their pension obligations. They've had to reduce their police force and their fire department coverage. You're seeing that in municipalities in Pennsylvania today. So all those different kinds of areas. Each municipality will feel differently. The mayor of Pittsburgh recently 2 days ago, suggested that the Pittsburgh School District needs to go into bankruptcy in order to get assistance. Erie School District is getting $14 million additional annually from the General Assembly. Harrisburg School District is in receivership. All of those are the trends that will start to exacerbate. In Pennsylvania, it will be your class 3 cities that will feel the hook first. Once that spiral starts, it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to stop. Does that help answer? Was it more than you wanted? I'm pretty passionate about this topic. I remember during the Revolutionary War, I had the same discussion with George Washington. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have a time frame of between 2 to 4 years to sort of get all these financial issues resolved before sort of irreparable damage is done? Could you sort of elaborate on that time frame, and how do you see it playing out with, I guess when it comes time for a full vote on some of these measures? How likely do you think folks on both sides of the aisle are able, the potential for them to sort of compromise and come to agreements on some of these issues?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I do want to, and I'm not just trying to be complimentary, but the leadership team in the House and the Senate have been absolutely superior to deal with in this issue. As an example, the pension reform bill got signed 2 years ago. That is a step in the right direction. We'll see the significant benefits of that in the years ahead. But that ought to give you an indicator. That was a significant reform. The full effect of that will take a full 30 years to take place. The Independent Office of Inspector General, which was a brilliant move, that was done 2 years ago as well. Putting the money into the rainy day fund, $322 million this past year, was significantly important. But I think what Representative Grove would say, and the people that you have behind you, behind me, that I'm so honored to serve with, is that what they've been able to do is recognize the need for these fiscal reforms. At the same time, we're spending at record clip. Our spending on social programs should be coming down if you're in the middle of a boom period with record low unemployment, and it's not happening. And we've got a whole bevy of reasons for that. I get it, but that should point out to you the magnitude of the problem. What I tell people is this, and to answer your question specifically, the next recession is going to hit in the next 2 to 4 years. The next recession and the lack of budgetary receipts will start to dictate priorities for us that many people will find unacceptable. We are already at the point in time in which there's no successful political solution that can be done. And I would encourage you to read the Independent Fiscal Office report. So the next recession will cause us to start taking these in much greater level of detail and a much deeper dive. But I think this team behind you has already laid significant groundwork, and our leadership team has been solidly behind questioning everything, even if it might be unpopular, to see what happens. I can tell you in my own case with House Bill 13, I had a significant number of groups on board if I could sell it to seniors. And again, Chamber, the NFIB, the bankers, the Bar Association, AARP, were very supportive, saying, let's see what happens in this process. And what Representative Grove advised me, it's too big of a nut to try to solve with one issue, but to be careful. Seth, I don't know if you had any comment you wanted to make on the timing of some of the other bills you're working on.
So one thing you have to look at for solvency of any entity is cash flow. Detroit went bankrupt because they couldn't pay bills. It was a cash flow issue. What's happening in Illinois is a cash flow issue. Right now, we are borrowing, the treasurer approved $1.5 billion of borrowing to meet cash flow payroll. Within any government system, you have kind of laws and revenue. We're in that law right now, but it's increasingly getting worse. And that adds cost. So if you borrow $1.5 billion for a few months, that's $11 million cost to taxpayers, and we're borrowing against ourselves. So when you have a budget, you shift money offline continually to fictionally show that you're spending lower than what you really are. You have spending above your ability to pay for it, recurring spending above the ability to pay for it with recurring revenue. You create long-term gaps. And those gaps exacerbate within your cash flow system. So cash flow is the first thing you need to look at how solvent an entity is. If you're borrowing to meet cash flow annually, you're not being prudent fiscal managers. And that's currently what we're doing. There was a few years there where we weren't having to do it. We borrowed $1.5 billion, so it was kind of a fake cash flow positive for us, but that's what I'm worried about over the short term. If pension payments continue to climb, mandated expenses within healthcare, OPED, Medicaid, those things continue to increase, debt continues to increase, it eats up dollars in discretionary funds, and soon you're faced with those decisions that Detroit had to make. They couldn't make payroll, they couldn't pay their bills, they had contractual obligations that they couldn't get out with fire and police service, and they had this huge pension liability that they couldn't pay. So what happened was, pensioners ended up with pennies on the dollar. They filed bankruptcy, and they're moving out of it, but I can tell you they're not out of it quite yet. So we don't want to see that here, and that's why we're having this discussion now. And I think the best thing we can do over the short term is look at a solvency commission, and 2, look at our cash flow. If we can secure the cash flow over the short term, we have a good chance of fighting and keeping alive if there's another big recession.
Someone used the term fiscal evasion when it comes to budgeting. Is that sort of what?
Yeah, so fiscal evasion, examples of that. So if you want to show in your general fund that you're spending a 2% increase, you can shift money over to special funds or offline to try to get it at a lower spend number. That's a fiscal evasion. Using one-time revenue to pay for recurring expenses, that's fiscal evasion. Using pension dollars to pay for general fund appropriations, that's fiscal evasion. So anything that tries to mask from taxpayers the total cost of budget and how you're funding it, that's fiscal evasion. Every state has used tricks to balance budgets in the past, and it usually exacerbates and leads to worse and worse financial management or worse financial conditions in each state. So you're better off looking at your finances. If you want to spend X amount, just pay for it. If you're not willing to pay for it, don't spend it. It's that simple. That's something we need to really focus on here in Pennsylvania. If you want the spending, it's recurring spending, foot the bill and pay for it. If not, don't ask for the spending.
Let me give you an additional information on the evasion. When an ARC payment wasn't made, that's a fiscal evasion. In other words, when we had an ARC payment, that 10-year window where the payments were not made as supposed to, that was a fiscal evasion. There's another fiscal evasion that's going on nobody even knows about because it's so complicated, people don't understand it. But at the most recent pension board meeting for the state and the teachers, as an example, on the PSERS board meeting, and it's a matter of public record, the treasurer, the secretary of banking, and myself as CPA voted against a 7.25% actuarial earnings rate. If you have 3 financial people saying that's not a good idea, you might want to listen. That's fiscal evasion. You all have been tremendous. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's a somber topic, but it's important for the survival of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which I know we can do. Thank you very much.